On the morning of September 9, 1942, Forest Ranger Howard Gardner could not have predicted that his routine night shift at the Mount Emily Lookout Tower in the dense forests of southern Oregon would forever enter the pages of history. The cold air of early autumn pierced through the pine branches as he stood at his elevated post, his eyes scanning the endless sea of forest that stretched toward the Pacific Ocean, just a few miles to the west. Dawn had not yet broken, and darkness enveloped the mountains like a heavy blanket. But something about this particular night was different. Something that would change the way America understood the war raging across the ocean. It had been only 9 months since Pearl Harbor. 9 months since Japanese aircraft descended upon Hawaii that terrible morning of December 7, 1941, dragging the United States into a global conflict already burning across 3 continents. Americans had grown accustomed to reading about battles in distant places. Midway, the Coral Sea, the Philippines, but the mainland remained untouched, protected by 2 vast oceans. Citizens bought war bonds, planted victory gardens, sent their sons and daughters overseas, but the actual territory of the United States seemed an impenetrable fortress. This illusion of safety, this comfort of geographic distance, was about to be shattered by 1 small floatplane and 2 incendiary bombs. Howard Gardner was a seasoned ranger, a man who knew these forests like the back of his own hands. He understood how fog crept through the valleys, how wind whispered through Douglas firs, how smoke from a distant campfire could distort the horizon. But around midnight, as he peered into the darkness, he saw something that fit none of his familiar categories. At first it was just a drone, a barely audible sound echoing through the mountains. Then light, a bright flash illuminating the sky somewhere to the east, deep in the forest near Grassy Knoll. Not lightning too bright, too focused. Not a meteor too slow, too deliberate. This was something else. Something man-made. Gardner's heart quickened. In these days, with the war so fresh in everyone's memory, even the slightest anomaly triggered alarm. He grabbed his phone, alerting the main Forest Service office in Brookings, a small fishing town hugging the coast. Within an hour, other spotters had confirmed something strange in the air that night. The drone of an engine, an unusual silhouette against the starlit sky. By dawn, firefighting crews were on the move, pushing through dense undergrowth, following the flash that Gardner had witnessed. What they found was both nothing and everything. Trees were scorched, earth singed in a small radius. A fire had flared, but recent rains had made the forest too wet for flames to spread.
Lucky, Incendiary lucky.
But among the charred remains, the firefighters discovered something that froze their blood. Fragments of metal, thermite residue, and most ominously, components that were not of American manufacture. They called in federal agents, and by the next day, the FBI was on site, meticulously gathering evidence. Their conclusion confirmed the worst fears. These were Japanese incendiary bombs. An enemy aircraft had just dropped ordnance on continental American territory for the first time in history. The news, though suppressed from the wider public to prevent panic, spread quickly through military channels. This was no random incident. This was a deliberate act of aggression, a carefully planned military maneuver that demonstrated an achievement no other foreign power had ever accomplished, striking at the very heart of America. But who could have done this? How could a Japanese aircraft reach the remote Oregon coast, drop its payload, and vanish into the night without being intercepted by American air defenses? The answer lay not in the sky but beneath the waves of the Pacific Ocean, in one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most innovative technological achievements, the aircraft-carrying submarine. If you could have descended beneath the ocean's surface approximately 15 miles off the Oregon coast that same night, you would have found one of the most extraordinary engineering marvels of World War II, quietly lying in wait. The I-25 was a B-1 class submarine, a sleek predator of steel and rivets, nearly 356 feet long and capable of diving to depths exceeding 300 feet. But what set I-25 and its sister boats apart from any other underwater vessel on Earth was what rested on its deck. A watertight hangar tube 115 feet long, containing a fully functional floatplane. The development of aircraft-carrying submarines had been one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's boldest experiments. The concept was simultaneously brilliant and audacious. If you could launch reconnaissance aircraft from submarines, you could extend your scouting range by thousands of miles, spotting enemy fleets long before they spotted you. More than that, you could approach enemy coastlines undetected, releasing aircraft for bombing or reconnaissance missions where conventional planes could never reach. The B-1 series submarines were the culmination of this technology. Each armed with a 140mm deck gun, 6 torpedo tubes, and sufficient fuel to cross the Pacific twice without refueling. They were designed for distance strikes, for surprise attacks, for bringing the war to the enemy's doorstep. The aircraft I-25 carried was the Yokosuka E-14Y, codenamed Glen by the Allies. A small, elegant floatplane with wings that folded for storage and pontoons that allowed it to take off and land on water. Fully loaded, the Glen weighed only about 4,000 pounds and had a wingspan of just 36 feet. It was ungainly, slow, almost delicate in appearance, but it was functional. Powered by a single Hitachi Tempu 12 radial engine producing 340 horsepower, the Glen could fly for up to 5 hours, covering a range of over 500 miles. Most importantly for this mission, it could carry up to 340 pounds of payload, enough for 276-kilogram incendiary bombs, specially designed to ignite forest fires. The commander of I-25 was Captain Meiji Tegami, a veteran submarine officer who had already taken the boat through several combat patrols in the Pacific. But the star of this particular mission was another man, much younger, Warrant Officer Nobuo Fujita, a 31-year-old pilot who had been assigned to fly the Glen on what would become one of the war's most daring aerial missions. Fujita was a quiet, refined man with a deep sense of duty to his emperor and country. He had trained to fly from submarines for years, practicing the delicate choreography of launch and recovery that could end in catastrophe with one mistake. Beside him was his navigator, Petty Officer Shoji Okuda, who would help guide him through the darkness to their target. The mission Fujita and I-25 had been given was part of a larger Japanese strategy that had been developing since Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, believed that Japan must not only fight the American war machine across the Pacific but also bring the war to American soil. Psychological warfare was as important as physical destruction. If Japanese aircraft could drop bombs on American cities, towns, or forests, it would force American armed forces to divert resources to homeland defense and demonstrate to the American people that they were not safe even in their own homes. The Pacific Northwest, with its vast stretches of dry coniferous forest, seemed an ideal target. One good incendiary forest fire could destroy millions of acres of timber, devastate the economy, strain firefighting resources, and perhaps even threaten cities and towns. Fujita had studied the maps for weeks. The forests of southern Oregon and northern California were dense, dry in summer and early autumn, and almost entirely undefended from the air. It was a vast, vulnerable target. The bombs he carried were thermite incendiary devices, designed to explode on impact and scatter combustible thermite compound over a wide area. In theory, even 2 devices could ignite an inferno that would spread for days, consuming everything in its path. This was terror from the air delivered to American soil. Launching the Glen from I-25 was a feat of precision and bravery. The submarine surfaced at the appointed hour, the crew immediately springing into action in the darkness. The hangar tube opened, and the aircraft, stored inside in a disassembled state, was hauled onto the deck. Wings and floats, neatly folded for storage, were now quickly attached by a team of mechanics working with minimal lighting, aware that every second on the surface made the submarine vulnerable to detection. Once the aircraft was assembled, it was placed on a short catapult track on the forward part of the submarine. Fujita and Okuda climbed into the cockpit, strapped themselves in, and prepared for launch. The catapult, powered by a charge of compressed air, hurled the small aircraft into the dark sky with a force that pressed the pilots back into their seats. Within seconds, the Glen was airborne, its engine roaring as Fujita pulled back on the stick and gained altitude. Below, I-25 quickly dove back beneath the waves, leaving the aircraft alone in the empty darkness above the Pacific. There was no radio contact, no fighter escort, no ground beacons to guide them. Fujita flew with only a compass, maps, and his own courage. As he turned east toward the coast, the moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale silver reflection on the waves below. He could see the dark outline of mountains rising above the coastline. Fujita flew low, avoiding detection by radar, though there were few in this remote part of Oregon. He held his course, counting the minutes. His target was approximately 20 miles inland, a large forest near Mount Emily, roughly north of Brookings. As he crossed the coastline, he gained altitude, climbing to approximately 6,000 feet. Through the darkness below, he could make out the heavy, dark green carpet of forest stretching in all directions. He released his bombs with the precision he had honed in countless training flights. 2 incendiary bombs fell through the sky, descending toward the forest below. Upon impact, they exploded, scattering combustible material, flaring with the bright white heat of thermite fire. Fujita could see the flashes below, tiny sparks of light in the endless sea of darkness. He banked and turned back toward the coast, his heart pounding with adrenaline, his mind already calculating the navigation points that would lead him back to I-25. What Fujita could not know, as he flew back toward the ocean, was that his bombs, while technically successful, would not achieve their intended effect. A stroke of weather and human response would transform what should have been catastrophe into historical footnote. The past days had brought rain to Oregon's forests, and the vegetation was far wetter than Japanese planners had anticipated. The incendiary bombs ignited trees and undergrowth near the impact site, but the fire could not take hold. Wet needles and moss, the thick layer of rain on the ground, even the humidity in the air, all conspired against the inferno Fujita had hoped for. Instead of a great conflagration, the flames smoldered and died within an hour. When firefighting crews arrived the next morning, they found only limited damage. But they also found evidence of something no one on continental American soil had ever seen: debris from foreign military ordnance. The FBI and military intelligence services quickly confiscated the evidence, combing the forest for additional clues. The metal fragments, explosive components, and thermite residue that were found were analyzed, and experts confirmed their Japanese origin. This had been an attempt to create a massive forest fire, a strike designed not just to destroy property but to sow terror. Officials faced a delicate situation. Public announcement of the attack could trigger panic, especially along the vulnerable West Coast, where fear of Japanese invasion was already running high. But complete silence was also risky. They settled on a strategy of controlled disclosure. Local officials and firefighters were briefed and ordered to be prepared, but the wider public was kept in the dark. A few vague mentions appeared in local newspapers about suspicious fires and unexplained incidents, but no details were provided. The strategy was to watch, wait, and prepare better defenses in case the Japanese came back. They did come back. 20 days later, on September 29, 1942, Nobuo Fujita once again climbed into the sky from the deck of I-25. This time the target was a different section of forest, approximately 50 miles east of the first attack, near the town of Port Orford. The mission was the same: drop incendiary bombs, ignite forest fires, sow chaos. And again, Fujita executed his mission flawlessly, navigating in darkness, releasing his payload, and returning to the submarine. And again, the wet forest refused to burn. The bombs exploded, ignited trees, created small hot spots of flame, but no widespread fire emerged. Firefighting crews, now prepared and on high alert after the first incident, responded quickly and extinguished what little flame arose. For the Japanese, the missions were technical successes but strategic failures. They had demonstrated that the Imperial Japanese Navy could strike American territory at will, that their submarines could operate undetected near American shores, and that their aircraft could drop bombs deep inland. But the psychological and physical impact they had hoped for never materialized. There was no inferno, no mass panic, no redeployment of American forces back to the West Coast. The war continued in the Pacific, and the attacks on Oregon became a minor footnote in the larger narrative. For the Americans, the lookout air raids, as they came to be called, were an uncomfortable reminder of vulnerability. They prompted improved anti-aircraft defenses along the West Coast, increased submarine patrols, and heightened vigilance among local firefighters and civilian spotters. But the incident also underscored incredible luck. Had the weather been drier, had the bombs landed elsewhere, had firefighting crews responded slower, the consequences could have been catastrophic. Burning forests could have destroyed towns, killed civilians, and diverted troops from the front. Instead, history records the Lookout air raids as curious, almost absurd attacks, the only instance of an enemy aircraft dropping bombs on continental American territory during World War II. But the story of Nobuo Fujita and the Lookout air raids did not end in 1942. In fact, the most extraordinary part of the narrative was yet to come, a chapter that would unfold over decades and transform a wartime pilot into a symbol of peace and reconciliation. The war ended in 1945 with Japan's complete defeat. Fujita, like millions of his countrymen, returned to a devastated nation, ravaged by war, scorched by bombings, and occupied by foreign forces. He went back to his pre-war life as a grape farmer, quietly working the land, never speaking much about his role in the war. For him, as for many veterans, the memories of the conflict were painful, complicated, interwoven with pride, regret, and deep relief that it was all over. For decades, the story of the Lookout air raids remained obscure. Americans moved forward, building the Pax Americana, and the war became a distant memory. But in the small town of Brookings, Oregon, local historians and elders remembered. They kept documents, collected stories, preserved the memory of the only enemy bombing on their soil. And in 1962, 20 years after the attack, someone had an idea. What if they invited Nobuo Fujita to return to Brookings, not as an enemy, but as a guest, as a symbol of reconciliation between two nations once at war? When the invitation reached Fujita at his small farm in Japan, he was deeply conflicted. Return to the place he had bombed? Face the people whose forests he had tried to burn? The shame of defeat, the burden of his wartime actions, the fear of being hated, all of these weighed heavily on him. But there was also curiosity, a desire to see what had become of that remote Oregon coast, and perhaps a hope for forgiveness. After much deliberation, he accepted. His arrival in Brookings in October 1962 was one of the most remarkable moments in the town's history. The local paper announced it, and residents gathered with a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and cautious goodwill. Fujita stepped off the plane wearing a formal suit, carrying with him an object of profound cultural significance. His family's 400-year-old samurai sword, a katana that had been passed down through generations. In Japanese culture, the katana was not merely a weapon but a symbol of honor, family legacy, and the samurai code of Bushido. For a warrior to give away his family sword was an act of immense humility and respect, an acknowledgement of defeat and a plea for forgiveness. At a ceremony in the Brookings City Library, Fujita stood before a crowd of Americans. Some veterans, some whose relatives had fought in the Pacific, some whose lives had been touched by the war in countless ways. Through an interpreter, he spoke quietly but clearly. He expressed deep regret for his actions, acknowledged the pain the war had caused, and offered the sword as a gesture of peace. He explained that in Japanese tradition, a samurai who brought dishonor upon himself might commit seppuku, ritual suicide. But he hoped instead that by offering his sword, by coming to this place and facing these people, he could find a different path to honor, one of reconciliation rather than death. The room was silent. Then, to Fujita's amazement, the people of Brookings accepted his gesture with grace. They invited him to visit the bombing site, to see the forest that had survived his attack. Local rangers took him up into the mountains, to the very spot where his incendiary bombs had fallen 20 years earlier. The trees had regrown. The forest, far from being destroyed, was thriving. Standing there among the Douglas firs and pine trees, Fujita felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that his bombs had not caused the destruction he had intended, sorrow for the waste of war, gratitude for the forgiveness he was being shown. The visit changed him. Over the following years, Fujita returned to Brookings multiple times, each visit deepening the bonds between him and the community. In 1992, on the 50th anniversary of the bombing, he returned again, now an elderly man of 81. This time, the town of Brookings named him an honorary citizen, an extraordinary gesture that moved him to tears. He planted a tree at the bombing site, a redwood seedling, a symbol of life, growth, and enduring friendship between Japan and America. The tree was planted with soil from both nations mixed together, a literal blending of earth from former enemies. Fujita became a regular correspondent with many Brookings residents. He sent letters, photographs, shared stories of his life. He invited local officials to visit Japan, and several did, cementing a sister city relationship that continues to this day. When Fujita died in 1997 at age 85, the people of Brookings mourned him as one of their own. They held a memorial service, and his family sent some of his ashes to be scattered in the forest where he had once dropped his bombs. It was a circle completed, a warrior's journey from aggression to peace, from enemy to friend. Today, if you travel to the forests outside Brookings, you can hike the bombing site trail, a path that leads to the spot where Fujita's incendiary bombs fell on that September night in 1942. There is a small plaque marking the location, explaining the history in measured, factual language. The forest around it is thick and green, alive with birdsong and the rustle of wind through branches. The redwood tree Fujita planted stands tall, healthy, a living monument to reconciliation. Nearby, informational signs tell the story of the lookout air raids of I-25 and the Glen floatplane, of the only enemy bombing on the American mainland during World War II. But the signs also tell the other story, the one of forgiveness, friendship, and the human capacity for change. They tell of a warrior who returned to the scene of his attack not to gloat but to apologize, not to defend his actions but to seek peace. They tell of a community that chose grace over revenge, understanding over hatred. And they tell of a bond that formed across cultures, languages, and the terrible chasm of war, proving that even the deepest wounds can heal with time, courage, and goodwill. The technical details of the mission are fascinating to military historians. The ingenious design of the aircraft-carrying submarine, the precision of launching and recovering a floatplane in open ocean, the audacity of striking enemy territory thousands of miles from home. The I-25, with its pressurized hangar, catapult system, and skilled crew, represented the cutting edge of submarine technology in 1942. The Glen floatplane, fragile though it appeared, demonstrated that even small, slow aircraft could accomplish strategic missions when deployed creatively. And the thermite incendiary bombs, while ultimately ineffective against the wet Oregon forests, showed Japanese understanding of both American geography and psychological vulnerabilities. But beyond the hardware and tactics, the lookout air raids reveal something deeper about war, memory, and human nature. They show that acts of aggression, even failed ones, leave lasting marks on communities and individuals. They demonstrate that the passage of time can transform enemies into friends, that context matters, and that understanding the humanity of those we once fought can lead to profound healing. Fujita's journey from naval pilot to peacemaker is not unique. Thousands of World War II veterans on all sides eventually came to similar reckonings with their wartime actions. But his story is particularly poignant because it played out in such a specific, symbolic way. The people of Brookings could have chosen differently. They could have refused Fujita's visit, rejected his apology, kept alive the anger and fear of that September night. But they chose another path, one that required its own kind of courage. To face the man who tried to burn your forest, to accept his sword, to invite him back year after year. This was not weakness but strength. It acknowledged that the war was over, that holding grudges serves no one, and that building bridges is harder and more important than maintaining walls. In the broader context of World War II, the lookout air raids barely register. No one was killed, minimal property was damaged, the strategic impact was negligible. Compared to the firebombing of Tokyo, the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the battles of Guadalcanal and Okinawa, this was a tiny incident. Yet it holds a unique place in American history precisely because of its uniqueness. This was the only time enemy bombs fell on the continental United States during the war. And paradoxically, because it was so small, because it failed so completely in its intended effect, it became possible for the story to evolve into something redemptive. Had Fujita's bombs ignited the massive forest fires intended, had hundreds or thousands died, had towns been destroyed, the path to reconciliation would have been infinitely more difficult. But the failure of the military mission created space for a different kind of success, a human one. The wet forest that refused to burn, the alert firefighters who contained the small blazes, the FBI's decision to keep details quiet. All these factors combined to prevent the tragedy that could have been. And in that space, years later, something beautiful could grow. The technological legacy of the Lookout air raids is also worth considering. The aircraft-carrying submarines that Japan developed represented a remarkable engineering achievement, one that influenced post-war submarine design worldwide. The concept of launching aircraft from submarines continued to evolve, eventually leading to submarine-launched missiles and other systems that define modern naval warfare. The I-25 itself continued to operate in the Pacific after the Brookings attacks, eventually sinking 2 American merchant ships before being destroyed by American forces in 1943. Its sister ships in the B-1 class met similar fates, most lost in combat before war's end. The Glen floatplane, ungainly and slow as it was, proved the concept that submarines could extend their reconnaissance capabilities through air power. Though Japan's aircraft-carrying submarines never achieved the strategic impact their designers hoped for, they represented innovative thinking about how to overcome the vast distances and limited visibility of Pacific naval warfare. The Allies studied captured examples carefully, learning from Japanese innovations even as they developed their own solutions to similar problems. For the Forest Service and firefighting communities in Oregon, the Lookout air raids had lasting impact. They demonstrated that even remote forests were potential military targets, leading to improved communication systems, better training, and closer coordination between civilian firefighters and military authorities. The lessons learned in those September nights of 1942, the importance of rapid response, the need for constant vigilance, the value of experienced spotters like Howard Gardner, informed firefighting practices for decades afterward. And for the FBI and military intelligence, the incidents provided valuable insights into Japanese capabilities and intentions. The analysis of the bomb fragments, the tracking of submarine movements along the West Coast, the assessment of vulnerability in coastal areas, all these fed into broader defensive strategies. The attacks, small as they were, proved that the Japanese could reach American shores, prompting increased coastal patrols, improved radar installations, and better coordination between military branches. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Lookout air raids is the story itself. The narrative of conflict transformed into friendship, of weapons turned into symbols of peace, of enmity evolved into understanding. In an era when the wounds of World War II were still raw, when anti-Japanese sentiment remained strong in America, the people of Brookings chose a different path. They saw in Nobuo Fujita not a monster but a man, not an eternal enemy but a fellow human being who had been caught up in the machinery of war, who had followed orders, who had done what he believed was his duty, and who later came to question those actions. Fujita's own journey mirrors that of many Japanese veterans who struggled with the aftermath of the war. Japan's militaristic culture, its emphasis on honor and sacrifice, its belief in the righteousness of its cause. All these came crashing down in 1945, leaving millions to grapple with difficult questions. What had they fought for? Were their sacrifices meaningless? How could they live with what they had done? For some, the answers never came or came only through silence and forgetting. But for Fujita, the answer came through facing his past directly, through returning to the place he had attacked, through offering what he valued most as a gesture of peace. The symbolism of the katana cannot be overstated. In Japanese culture, a samurai sword is not a mere object but an embodiment of the warrior's soul, a physical manifestation of honor, duty, and family legacy. For Fujita to offer his family's 400-year-old blade to the people of Brookings was to offer himself, his history, his honor. It was an acknowledgement that the old ways, the ways of Bushido and absolute loyalty to emperor and nation, had led to catastrophe, and that a new way must be found. The fact that Brookings accepted the sword and later returned it to his family, while also embracing Fujita himself, created a powerful mutual exchange that transcended the usual categories of victor and vanquished. The redwood tree Fujita planted is equally symbolic. Redwoods are among the longest-lived, most resilient trees on Earth, some surviving for over 2,000 years. To plant a redwood is to plant something for future generations, to make a statement about endurance, survival, and hope. That tree, growing now in the Oregon forest, stands as a living bridge between Japan and America. A reminder that life continues, that growth is always possible, that even from the ashes of war, something beautiful can emerge. The relationship between Brookings and Japan, fostered by Fujita's visits, continues to bear fruit. Student exchanges, cultural programs, economic partnerships, all these flow from that initial gesture of reconciliation in 1962. The bombing site, far from being a place of anger or resentment, has become a destination for those interested in peace studies, conflict resolution, and the complex processes of post-war healing. School groups visit, learning not just about the military history but about the human story, about how former enemies became friends, about how courage can take many forms. In the end, the Lookout air raids remind us that history is not just about the big battles and famous generals, but also about small moments that reveal larger truths. 2 incendiary bombs falling into a wet Oregon forest on a September night, militarily insignificant, strategically meaningless, historically minor. Yet from this tiny incident came a story of profound human significance, one that teaches us about forgiveness, reconciliation, and the possibility of transformation. Nobuo Fujita's life spanned the full arc of 20th century Japanese history. Born in the era of imperial expansion, trained as a warrior in the tradition of the samurai, thrust into a global war, defeated and humbled, and finally redeemed through acts of courage that were peaceful rather than martial. His story is not unique, but it is particularly well documented and symbolically powerful. In him, we see the possibility that individuals can transcend their worst moments, that actions taken in war do not have to define a person forever, that the capacity for change and growth remains alive even in old age. The people of Brookings, for their part, demonstrated a kind of moral courage that is all too rare. To welcome back someone who had tried to destroy your community requires a leap of faith, a willingness to believe in the possibility of human redemption, a commitment to breaking cycles of revenge and hatred. They could have said no, could have kept Fujita at arm's length, could have accepted his apology while maintaining distance. Instead, they embraced him, invited him back repeatedly, made him part of their community, and in doing so, helped him find the peace he sought. As you stand today at the bombing site, surrounded by towering trees and the sounds of the forest, it is hard to imagine that this peaceful place was once the target of military attack. The scars have healed, the forest has regrown, and nature has reclaimed what was briefly disturbed. The trail is well maintained, the markers clear, and the atmosphere is one of reflection rather than anger. Hikers pause to read the plaques, to consider the strange turns of history, to think about war and peace and the long, difficult journey from one to the other. The Lookout air raids, the only enemy bombing of the mainland United States during World War II, stand as a reminder that every war contains thousands of small stories, each with its own arc, its own participants, its own resolution. This particular story, beginning with fire from the sky and ending with friendship across oceans, offers a message of hope. That even the deepest divisions can be bridged, that former enemies can become partners in peace, and that the courage to seek reconciliation can be as powerful as the courage to fight. In the end, what happened in the forests of Oregon in September 1942, and in the decades that followed, is not just a military footnote but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and our eternal capacity for forgiveness, understanding, and peace.